Watercolor is so easy, said no one ever. And the one thing that makes it quite tricky, especially for beginners, is the lack of white paint. In this video, I'm going to explain why it is not advisable to use pure white pigment when painting with watercolors, what you should do instead, and how you can improve your results when painting even the most intricate white details like this delicate lily of the valley. As always, I will take you through the entire painting step by step so you can recreate the artwork on your own, and I'll give you lots of tips for painting greenery, lights and shadows, and other things in addition to our main topic of discussion for today. I'm going to sketch out my lily of the valley flowers using 2 reference photos that I decided to combine, and I linked the references in the video description below. If you're following me on Patreon for the slower step-by-step version of this tutorial in real time, you can also download a black and white outline along with process images for every step of this project. The painting is dedicated to everyone born in May, since Lily of the Valley is the official birth flower of that month. The first thing we're going to do is paint the green leaves that surround the white flowers, carefully working around the tiny buds, leaving them completely dry. We are creating white shapes by painting around them, and at no point during this process do we need to introduce white paint. This recommendation to avoid using pure white pigment in watercolor is based on preserving the inherent transparency and luminosity of the medium. While there are exceptions and alternative techniques, which I will touch on at the end of this video, it is generally recommended to rely on the white of your paper and translucent watercolor layers to paint white objects with watercolors. By adding pure white pigment directly to watercolor, you risk creating a very chalky, opaque layer that can really overpower the delicate transparency of your colors. So this is a much better approach, and of course if this was any other medium like acrylic or gouache, we would use white paint to cover the flowers, but with watercolor we need to leave the white objects dry without any paint. Notice too that I'm adding subtle variations in green color temperature to avoid a boring flat look. A little bit of bluish green is more appropriate for the shadows, and I'm using aqua green from Winsor & Newton. Hooker's green is my main pigment, and some vibrant green gold from Daniel Smith is helping me create luminous highlights on those leaves that are facing towards the sun. Let's add a little bit of burnt sienna on dry stems, and our next step is to create some subtle shadows inside flower buds so we can differentiate between the inside and the outside of each lily flower. When painting white objects, even when you're leaving dry white paper, it's always helpful to mark up the main shadows to create a better sense of three-dimensional form on paper. And I'm using a very light, watered-down mix of diaxazine purple and aqua green. You can simply use any blue straight from the tube very lightly. Once again, we are avoiding white pigment, using clear water to make our colors lighter. The reason for this is that watercolor paints are traditionally transparent or semi-transparent, and using white pigment, which is extremely opaque by definition, will instantly alter the transparency and luminosity of your watercolor. If you do this, you will instantly lose the one thing that makes watercolors unique, this beautiful luminosity and glow that is only possible with transparent colors. Let's add another layer of green around the flowers, this time using more saturated, juicier version of the same green, and you can see already with just 2 layers of color our flowers are taking shape, slowly emerging, so to speak, from the background without any white pigment used. We're creating an illusion of white petals by leaving these areas unpainted, allowing the white of the paper to show through. You can use this technique to paint any white object, a flower or a bird. I have lots of tutorials on my YouTube channel and Patreon showing you how to paint larger white flowers. You can even paint a white building surrounded by greenery if you're into landscapes. And instead of using pure white pigment, rely on the white of the paper itself to serve as the lightest value in your painting. In watercolor painting, we always build our colors from light to dark, so it's time to add the darkest, strongest shadows on the leaf and maybe a few on the flower buds, and I will answer the question that's probably been on your mind since the start of this video. So why do some watercolor sets include a white tube or a white pen? I think this may be extremely confusing for beginners, and I really wish it came with a disclaimer, but hopefully this video will help clarify some of the confusion. And if you know someone who is just starting with watercolors and might find this discussion interesting, do share the video. I think it might help a lot of beginner artists avoid some common frustrations. So there are instances where artists may choose to use opaque white pigment in watercolor painting, but it requires careful consideration and technique. Generally, there are two cases where it might be appropriate, and these include adding tiny highlights or making corrections in your watercolor artwork, like if you have an uneven edge or an accidental splash of paint. One thing to keep in mind is that regardless of the brand, your white watercolor pigment will never be fully opaque, so it's quite ineffective even in these limited scenarios. Many artists, including me, actually prefer to use white gouache instead. Gouache is just a much more opaque water-based paint, and it can provide much better coverage and opacity while still being compatible with watercolors. However, it is important to note that the use of gouache can change the overall appearance and characteristics of your watercolor painting for reasons that we just discussed. But don't take my word for it. Let me show you the exact effect of using white watercolor, and I'm going to open a new pen that came as part of this Cotman beginner watercolor set, a great high quality option from Winsor & Newton for anyone who's starting out and maybe not sure about investing in the professional grade watercolors just yet. And as you can see, I've never opened the white pen, so I will do it right now, and I will show you what white watercolor looks like when I introduce it to our Lily of the Valley painting. So first of all, this looks a bit unnatural right away in the sense that it doesn't fit with the rest of the style of this painting because it looks quite heavy, frankly. The white paint sort of sits on top of the green, which goes against the whole logic of watercolors, the essence of what watercolor painting is all about, which is luminosity and transparency. But what's actually worse is that it's fading. As you can see, the white is being slowly absorbed by the green in the underlying layer. So it's not even that effective, and this is why, as I mentioned earlier, if you do add white, go for white gouache, so at least it's more effective at creating opaque, lighter accents that won't fade as much. Don't get me wrong, I love decorative style and I use a lot of white gouache in my paintings all the time, but it's a completely different look and feel, quite distinct from what I've been trying to achieve here with these light and soft lily of the valley flowers. There's another way of painting white, which I didn't mention yet, and it includes the use of masking fluid, a very interesting, a bit more advanced, sometimes messy approach that I use quite often in my work, but it's a topic for another video. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I will be posting it soon, and if you want to learn more about painting greenery specifically, check out this video above where we take a deep dive into beginner and more advanced techniques for painting green leaves, including the use of granulating watercolors. Have a beautiful day. I will see you next week with new watercolor tutorials.